Hi, I'm Cait Martinez. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. I'm advised by Ben Kirtman. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, our collaborators, Sarah Larson and Bob Payne at North Carolina State University. And today I'm going to be talking about ocean memory in ENSO initial conditions, and more specifically, whether subsurface preconditioning can constrain event outcomes. So to set the stage, ENSO is, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, is the dominant mode of interannual climate variability in the tropical Pacific, and it's a coupled ocean-atmosphere cycle recurring every 3 to 7 years. And it involves changes in sea surface temperatures, subsurface temperatures, winds, convection, etc. But the effects of ENSO extend far beyond the Pacific through atmospheric teleconnections. ENSO modulates the climate globally, affecting agriculture, fisheries, water resources, and extreme events. And so understanding ENSO really and being able to predict it well has real societal consequences. And fundamentally, it's a coupled system, or a coupled problem, and it's driven by these interactions between the atmosphere and the ocean, and the exchange of energy and momentum across that air-sea interface. And so this schematic here, this is a very simplified schematic of a lot of processes happening between the atmosphere and the ocean, but one key mechanism is the Birkness feedback, and so this is where anomalous sea surface temperatures drive changes in winds, which reinforce and amplify those SST anomalies through upwelling, thermocline displacement, zonal advection, etc. But there's also this external stochastic forcing element, and this is just random noise, weather noise that can kick the system in one way or the other. And so you kind of have this like tug of war kind of between these deterministic coupled dynamics and this external stochastic noise. And that's kind of what makes ENSO predictability such a rich and complicated question. And sort of traditionally, the subsurface preconditioning is considered the main source of ENSO predictability. And subsurface preconditioning is just a buildup of anomalous ocean heat content in the equatorial Pacific. So what I'm showing here is just the 1997, 1998 El Niño event as an example. On the top panel, we have January 1997. And you can see this like warm subsurface precursor in January. Can you see my thing? Yeah, this warm, I'm like scared to use the laser pointer. I've never done that before. So you can see this warm subsurface preconditioning forming months before the event matures at the surface. And then again, by January 1998, when we have this mature El Niño event, we see this cold subsurface preconditioning forming here in the Western Pacific there. And so this is already setting up this transition to a La Niña. But if preconditioning was the whole story, then ENSO would be perfectly predictable, and it's not. So the question is how much does the ocean memory actually constrain what happens next? And to address this, we construct a baseline climate state without ENSO. So this is a 500-year simulation in CESM2. We call it the no ENSO simulation. And it's dynamically decoupled the tropical Pacific wind-driven dynamics from the atmosphere. And so this essentially severs that Birkness feedback. So there's a lot of plots here. On the top left, so subplot A, here I'm showing the Niño 3-4 SST anomalies. The control is in green, and the no ENSO simulation is in purple. And you can see that the no ENSO has dramatically suppressed variability. And the PDF in panel B kind of confirms this, right? It shows this really tight distribution near zero versus that control's wider spread. And again, with the variance, with this zonal wind stress variance ratio in C, we see that wind stress variance is substantially reduced in that equatorial band. And these spatial maps on the right are the SST variance in December for the control on top and no ENSO on the bottom. And you can see just, again, the no ENSO just completely flat, whereas the control shows high concentration of variance along the equator. And so this really is just this clean reference state without an ENSO cycle, without any subsurface preconditioning or any ENSO-related variability. And from this, we can then initialize a 60-member release experiment. And so we lift these decoupling restraints of the ENSO simulation in March, and we let the system evolve freely. So what I'm showing here is the Niño 3.4 SST anomaly regressed onto the subsurface temperatures. In the top row is the control, and you can see these warm subsurface anomalies, these subsurface preconditioning forming before the surface signal in the east. And this is kind of in line with that. Subsurface preconditioning is the dominant source of predictability. But in the release experiment on the bottom row, so these first 3 panels are of ENSO, and then we initialize the ensemble in March, we see that there's really nothing in the subsurface to begin with in the ENSO, but when the events start to develop, these subsurface anomalies are actually they're developing at the same time as the surface event, and so they kind of co-evolve. And this isn't generally this is more in line with maybe coupled instability theory. And so now to get right back into like what the actual ensemble looks like, on the left here I have the Niño 3.4 SST. So this is for the 60-member ensemble. Each line is a member. This is the annual cycle. The black dashed line is the ensemble mean. And then on the right, I have the Niño 3.4 SST error swath. So this is basically the anomalies. And I have the members colored by their outcome in December. So there's red for El Niño, blue for La Niña, and gray for neutral. And you can see we get 21 El Niños, 21 La Niñas, and 18 neutrals. And this is a pretty perfectly symmetric distribution. And so what this is kind of showing us here is that ENSO events do readily develop and grow to substantial amplitude purely from coupled instabilities alone. There's no preconditioning in the initial conditions. There's no preceding event. There's no large-scale wind stress triggers. And this is actually consistent with earlier work that's been done by Larson and Kirtman. And it's actually pretty pessimistic from an ENSO predictability standpoint. It says that without preconditioning in your initial conditions, you really don't have a basis or little basis for constraining that forecast. Anything can happen. It can go El Niño, La Niña, or neutral. So this kind of begs the question then, does this precursor, this subsurface preconditioning even really matter? And to test this, we kind of go beyond that ENSO neutral state, and we initialize ensembles from a deliberately extreme simulation that has very strong preconditioning. So now I'm showing you similar figures to what I had before, but now I've got this high freq, high amp, it's a high frequency, high amplitude, this simulation. It's a 200-year simulation, also in CESM2. It's run with a very high frequency. It's got a 2-year periodicity and a high amplitude. And so that's shown in the orange there. And you can see that there is much larger, as we'd expect, much larger variance in the tightly along the equator in the SST variance. And so what we do then is we select years from the warm surface preconditioning and years from the cold surface preconditioning, and we can initialize 2 new release experiments, which we called the recharged and the discharged experiments. And here's the result from that. So again, on the left, we see that's that same no precursor, no ENSO neutral state release experiment that I showed earlier. With the wide symmetric spread of outcomes. That's kind of like this baseline without ENSO-related subsurface preconditioning. And on the right side is the recharged and the discharged ensembles. So for previous work, Larson and Kirtman, 2019, you'd expect that the warm preconditioning would shift and narrow the outcomes towards an El Niño and cold towards La Niña. So this warm begets warm, cold begets cold. But that's not what we see here. And so we have the discharged ensemble in blue. And the reason so the discharged ensemble is saying that there's cold subsurface preconditioning in the west. And here we're showing that in the initial condition SST in the east, this Niño 3.4 is warm. And that's because of that high frequency, that 2-year periodicity. But what we see is that almost all of them go warm, or almost all of these go cold. So they overwhelmingly evolve towards cold. And similarly for the recharge ensemble, the warm subsurface goes warm towards La Niña. And so, yeah, this preconditioning is, in fact, constraining the outcomes, but into the opposite phase. So with Larson and Kirtman, 2019, they have cold subsurface preconditioning going cold, and then warm subsurface preconditioning going warm. Now the difference is that they used a 4-year periodic ENSO cycle, whereas here we have this 2-year periodicity. But what I feel like I can confidently say here is that the preconditioning, that subsurface precursor, must know something about the outcome, or know something about the periodicity. The preconditioning is constraining those outcomes, but it's really telling, there must be something in that ocean memory, in that initial condition that tells you where the cycle is heading, and not necessarily reinforcing that current phase. And that's an important finding for how we think about ocean memory in seasonal prediction. And just a few summary points, I guess. There's still a lot more work to be done, but we showed that suppressing ENSO variability gives a baseline for understanding the system without ENSO cycle subsurface preconditioning. We saw that ENSO-like events readily develop from coupled instabilities alone, and we saw that subsurface preconditioning must know something, or we think it must know something about that periodicity, that there's that ocean memory that's somehow embedded in that instantaneous initial state. And thank you for your attention, and I might have a time for a question.